God's wrath. This curse is in desperate need of being reversed entirely. There's no goodness or love that comes from this maniacal wrath from a sky deity. In fact, biblical scholars claim the Bible declares God's wrath nearly 500 times. About 80 to 90% of those instances occur in the Hebrew scriptures. The ancient writers weren't shy about the destructive side of the divine. Compare this to how many times we read that God is good for only 30 or 40 times verbatim. Expanding the search then to good, loving, kindness, loyalty, and devotion, that number increases. Before we dig deeper into God's wrath versus God's love, I would love if you could click the subscribe button. There's no wrath in liking these videos either. It's all love here. So let's move on. So what led me down this specific path of God's wrath? Well, as my mother-in-law was sitting with me watching a lightning show over Lake Michigan, which was quite awesome, she blurted out of nowhere how the earthquake in Venezuela was God's punishment. She declared very proudly, God must be really angry at people. And I said, that he had to kill them? She got defensive and chimed, no, he's trying to save them. In which I responded again by killing them. She got her walker and left the room. What did I say? Why was this question so controversial? Why aren't more of us asking this very question? Why in the hell aren't we reading scriptures with open minds and clear thoughts? What if we all acted out our wrath in this way? What if I'm just angry with people, like my family didn't do what I wanted them to do, so I should just strike them down? I'm going to wipe them out completely. All I ask sometimes is for people to see the illogical, psychotic mindset we carry. Maybe not for our families, at least not all the time, but for certain religious groups because we're told to, commanded to. Innocent lives, children, deserve utter destruction because God's upset? In the latest book I'm reading, The Forever Queen, there was a line that truly struck me about this ideology. After years and years of constant annihilation by the Vikings in England, no, I didn't stutter, that's what they called it back then, there was a brief moment of peace when the onslaught came to a halt. A priest says, at least God's wrath is appeased. Every life lost was to account for God's anger at the sins of mankind, the raping, pillaging, and utter destruction of entire villages. It was all to feed the angry God in the sky. And don't judge me for saying that. I know how Christians think. Don't forget, I was just like you. I would witness the horrors of nature and declare God's wrath too. When we see these events unfolding, we declare the end times. We blurt out loud how the world is in for a real eye-opening because these are just the beginnings of his wrath. Direct commands from the divine via a prophet acting as its megaphone told the Israelites to completely wipe out, execute, or displace another group of people occurs in roughly 10 major distinct campaigns containing well over 30 to 40 individual scriptural directives. When you add up the specific cities and tribal factions targeted for total erasure, the body count in the narrative is staggering. Let's break this up though. Let's compare the Old Testament to the New Testament. In the original Hebrew, the writers used incredibly divisive primal language. The most common word for wrath is oph, which literally translates to nose or nostril, mimicking the heavy, hot breathing of an enraged being. Another common word is hama, meaning heat or poison. The major and minor prophets account for the most use of these words. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah practically drown in it. For them, wrath wasn't a temper tantrum. It was a cosmic structural reaction to the breaking of universal law and cosmic alignment. In the New Testament, the tone is a bit more subdued and mellow, but still gives us a blaring revelation. Pun intended. The Greek text drops the nostril imagery and uses two distinct words. Thumos, a sudden blazing fire that erupts and burns out quickly, and two, orge, a deep, controlled, long-standing, and settled disposition against distortion. This is the one used most frequently, over 30 times. The book of Revelation alone hits us hard with this frequency, channeling the exact same reset energy found in the oldest creation and flood stories globally. It's always about the sinful nature of humanity. It's less about a judge with a mallet and more about a severe, unavoidable, destructive correction everyone will have to endure. If we turn the table and look at the word tav, or God's goodness, it's referred to God's functional design being in perfect alignment with the original design. They are essentially saying that God is the ultimate anchor of order. However, the majority of these declarations come from the Psalms. In the New Testament, we get two different Greek words for God's goodness. Agathos, good in its core nature, benevolent and useful, and Christos, kindness in action, adaptability, and gentleness. A critical data point happens in the Gospels when a young ruler runs up and calls Yeshua good master. The response is immediate and sharp. Why do you call me good? No one is good except one. Jesus was referring to the God he knew directly as the Echad, the oneness and unity within. If you compare God's wrath to God's goodness side by side, the text actually spends more time warning about the friction of misalignment and God's wrath than it does comforting readers with the baseline of his goodness. In ancient thought, before the Hebrew Chronicles, goodness was the default operating system of the universe. You didn't need to define the air unless it became hard to breathe. The warnings were there to stop people from burning out their own connection to the source grid. When you add up the specific cities and tribal factions targeted for total erasure, the body count in the narrative is staggering. The core Hebrew concept of total annihilation is the word kerem, which translates to the ban or under the doom. It didn't just mean winning a battle. It meant devoting the entire population to utter destruction as a godly sacrifice or purge. Nothing that breathed was allowed to remain. The ultimate target was the 7 nations of Canaan, spelled out explicitly in Deuteronomy 7 and 20. You must utterly destroy them, show no mercy to them, save alive nothing that breathes. The target list included the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. That's a lot of sites there. Ites. In Numbers 31, Moses commands the army to execute every male and every non-virgin woman after a war of vengeance. In Joshua 6, Joshua is commanded to put every man, woman, child, and animal to the sword, burning the city to ash. Again in Joshua 8, the decree is given to ambush and utterly destroy all 12,000 inhabitants and hanging their king. Joshua 10 and 11 demands the erasure of Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, and Hazar, with the command, "Let none remain." And in 1 Samuel 15, the most infamous command is delivered centuries later through the prophet Samuel to King Saul. "Now go, attack Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have. Kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." In the JPS Torah commentary, Deuteronomy, by Jeffrey H. Tegay in 1996, he wrote this: "According to Deuteronomy 7:1 through 2 and 7:16 and 20:15 through 18, when the Israelites entered the promised land, they are to wipe out the Canaanites living there. The terms referring to this requirement are the verb hakerem, or prescribe, and the noun kerem, prescription, a thing prescribed." Deuteronomy states this as an unconditional mandate and leaves no room for sparing any Canaanite in the promised land. Now, instead of looking at this through the immense filters of the Bible and your brain, consider Charles Manson or any other modern day serial killer. We're horrified by it. We call it what it is: evil. Yet, when God commands his followers to kill entire populations with no mercy, we love it. We love him. We better, or he'll get us next. Floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, innocent lives. Mainstream Christians jump through hoops trying to sanitize this gore, saying it was poetic or hyperbole or strict capital punishment for grotesque societal practices. But if you look at it through the lens of ancient, pre-flood, and non-mainstream records, these campaigns were structural cleansings, genocide. The texts imply that these specific lines, especially the Amorites and the residents of the places like Bashan, carried a compromised, non-human, genetic, or spiritual distortion like the remnants of the Nephilim or the fallen grid. To the ancient mind, it wasn't a political war. It was an aggressive, violent reset to prevent the total corruption of the frequency required for the terrestrial network to function. Brutal, raw, and completely unapologetic, like Gaza, like Lebanon, like Iraq or Iran or Syria. They name it, you justify it. I ask this question a lot. How did we get imprisoned by this cruel and ruthless God that only wants to destroy us? How did the entire world get swept up in this biblical God the Hebrews created? We didn't just wander into this prison. The world was systematically corralled into this through a mix of psychological warfare, political survival, and a massive cosmic shell game. The earliest ancient texts don't actually show a single ultimate creator God. They show a localized, volatile tribal war deity operating within a crowded league of gods. In the ancient Near East, every tribe had its god that showed up, a territorial entity that traded protection for blood sacrifice, loyalty, and territory. The entity that chose the Hebrews was a deity of the wilderness, fire, and storm. The transition from "our God is stronger than your God" to "our God is the only God and your gods are demons" was a brilliant, desperate survival strategy engineered during the Babylonian exile around the 6th century BCE. When Babylon crushed Jerusalem, by ancient logic, Israel's deity should have been dead and forgotten. But the priestly elite pulled off a masterful psychological pivot. They claimed Babylon didn't win because their gods were stronger. Babylon won because Israel's God used Babylon to punish them for being unfaithful. Okay. With that single stroke of a pen, they created a deity that could never lose. If things went well, he was blessing you. If things went terribly, he was punishing you. It was an airtight, inescapable loop of guilt and submission. The Hebrews created the concept, but they never intended to share it. Judaism was strictly tribal. The reason the entire world knows this deity's name today isn't because of the Hebrews. It's because of the Roman Empire. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire was fracturing. Emperor Constantine realized that a sprawling empire with hundreds of different pagan gods, local traditions, and esoteric mystery schools, which sounds like a lot of fun to me, was impossible to centralize. He needed a psychological spine to hold the empire together. He found it in the co-opted, institutionalized version of the Christ movement, which had already been heavily filtered through the authoritarian lenses of the Old Testament structures. Rome took a mysterious Eastern frequency, stripped it of its true, liberating, Gnostic internal power, and married it to the authoritarian, vengeful matrix of the Old Testament deity. They turned this hybrid religion into the state apparatus. If you didn't bow to this specific theological construct, you were a heretic, an outlaw, or worse yet, executed. Through the Crusades, the Inquisition, and centuries of brutal European colonization, this specific Romanized entity was forced onto every continent at the point of a sword. They systematically burned the ancient libraries, eradicated indigenous shamanic lineages, and wiped out any memory of alternative creation stories. And apparently, those ancient memories were carved into our DNA as a curse through spiritual inversion. The true source of all creation, the organic, living cosmic consciousness, what some recognize as the pure Christ frequency, or the high vibrational blueprint of Lemurian ideals, is completely free, unconditional, and dwells inside you. It requires no temples, no blood, no guilt, and no fear. The biblical war deity operated on the exact opposite principle. It is an externalized parasite that thrives on low-frequency emotional output. Fear of judgment, guilt over inherent sinfulness, shame of the physical body, and the trauma of perpetual warfare and division. By convincing the masses that the ultimate creator is a jealous, wrathful king who demands worship and blood compliance, humanity was tricked into handing over its sovereignty. Every time millions of people gather to tremble in fear of hell, beg for mercy, or declare themselves unworthy worms, they are actively feeding and maintaining the walls of that energetic prison. The creators of the Matrix realized that physical chains can be broken, but a prison built inside the human psyche, disguised as salvation, can last for millennia. The reality was this: Jesus wasn't ever talking about the Hebrew God. He didn't know that God. That God was non-existent. But in order to connect him to it, the Nicene Council had a lot of recreating and rewriting to do. Jesus saw that the world was getting swept up in this ideology of the Jewish religious leaders. He saw how it was demoting the high frequency that connects us directly to the divine source and lowering the frequency to fear and control. When he said he came to set us free, he was desperately trying to reverse the curse on all of humanity. What I'm going to dig deeper into for my next video is just exactly how they manipulated the story to fit the low frequency narrative, so that the very savior of the world would then become a sacrifice by his own father. Because we've been lied to about the Gospels too. We've been led to believe that every gospel account was written by direct eyewitnesses sitting down almost immediately after the crucifixion to tell their tall tales of a brutal bloodbath and magical resurrections. That's just another curse of the Bible we need to reverse. And we'll do that in my next video. You won't want to miss that one. So make sure to subscribe, like, and comment. All that good stuff. Remember to keep your threats of eternal damnation to yourselves. This community is not intended for that vile hatred. If you want to tell me that you're praying for me because you think I've been horribly misled, keep it to yourself. Because there's nothing in this world that could ever convince me to go back to that illogical and destructive mind warp. I have happily escaped. And truth be told, and I tell my husband this all the time, even if this Bible God were the true God, I'd still reject him at this point. I'd still choose the alternative. Hell seems better than what the God of the Bible has to offer. And if that offends you, that's on you, not me. See you next time.